We're feeling a little bit formal seated up here under the bright lights, a little bit higher than all of you, but we really do want to make today's discussion very open and easy, and we're really going to welcome a lot of questions as we get towards the end of the session, okay? So we're going to focus on about 45 minutes of more formal questions and dialogue, and then open it up to all of you, so you don't have to just sit here and listen to us the whole time, even though, of course, we have lots of interesting things to say. So who am I, by the way? So my name is Patsy Doerr. And I run corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion globally for Thomson Reuters. And I'm delighted to be here today as a moderator, although I also have a lot to say on the topic. So we're going to kind of play the role of moderator, panel member as well. But our topic today, as you know, is really focused on the multi-generational workforce. And if we think about the backdrop of today's society, in the business world, in the community globally, we're looking at the first time in history where we actually have 5 generations, 5, not 4, generations in the workplace today, right? So ranging from age 19 to 72. Some of us are calling us different generations. I was calling myself a fake millennial earlier, but we know that's not the case. But in any case, it's a real issue for us to face. You know, whether you are an individual, whether you work in a corporation, in the government, in a social setting, or whatever the case may be, there are clearly opportunities and challenges that are changing the demographics of how we need to operate in the business community today. And so with that, we know the business case is very clear. I think those of you who've spent any time in the corporate world or beyond, we know that the data, the research, the statistics are out there. The case is very, very clear that diversity in the workplace makes an impact on not only employee engagement, productivity, innovation, but it also makes a direct impact to the bottom line and customer loyalty and long-term profitability. And so we want to get to some of those issues as well today. But we also want to focus on, and we spoke about this as a panel before we had the opportunity to meet live today, that we really want to get quite practical too. So with the business case being clear, also knowing what the backdrop is, we want to really get to some real suggestions as to what we can do as leaders in our organizations, but also as individuals as well, driving change in all of the roles that we're in. From a Thomson Reuters perspective, we're very much focused on this whole concept of social impact and social innovation. And that's the reason why we brought together corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion, because it's really about how do you talk about, how do you operate as being a responsible business. And we see that as a real value add, not only for attracting talent and customers, but also for driving business. And you'll see that will be a theme that comes throughout the course of the conversation today. Another topic that we talked about before we met today is that this is not a soft issue. None of this is about soft or doing the right thing. Obviously, we want to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, these are real hard issues that we're facing, and we see the impact on the bottom line. So with that backdrop, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel, some of whose names I can say better than others. So we started to go with a first name basis, if you're okay with that. But in any case, so we're joined by Amy Friedrich, who's the SVP of Special Benefits at the Principal Financial Group. And so we're welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. Julie Sweet, who's the CEO of North America at Accenture. See, these are easier last names. I can say them. This is not a problem. And then, of course, we have our only man on the panel today. He's very proud to be the only man. We're happy to have him. Eric Termuende.
Perfect.
Yes, there you go. So he's the co-founder of an organization called Generation Y. And he is actually a millennial who has a lot of stories to tell us personally, but also from the perspective of some research that his organization has done on this topic. And then here we go. We've got Aniela Unguresan, the co-founder of the EDGE Certified Foundation. And a lot of her work is focused on building out diversity, looking at different aspects of career development in a multi-generational workforce. And then finally, Ahu told me that I could just say Ahu because it's Yildirmaz.
Perfect.
Is that right?
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
We got it. So she is the VP of Market Insights and the head of Market Insights at ADP Research Institute. So you'll see deliberately the panel is comprised of people from all across different industries, all across the globe, and some people who are doing research in the space and some people who are practitioners in the space. And that's a deliberate design. So we're going to make this lively and fun. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a number of different questions, and we're going to go with the flow. We're not going to go each panel member by each panel member, but we really want to just kind of open up the dialogue, as I said at the beginning. So work for everybody? You guys good? Okay. All right. So our first question is quite broad, and really it's focused on, what do you all think are the primary benefits of a multi-generational, diverse workforce? And I'm going to ask you to start, Eric.
Sure. I mean, as mentioned, there are now up to 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. I think that, even at lunch, we heard from Guru from IBM, part of the brains behind Watson. He said that 90% of the technological information in the world today has been created in the last 2 years. And so when we look at this technological integration into the workplace, I think that in some cases we're dehumanizing the workplace or fragmenting it or decentralizing it as well and replacing communication with automated onboarding, training, and communication within organizations. And so the idea of collaborating and bringing 5 generations together and having this meaningful communication and relationship building, I think ultimately brings workplaces together when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about integration, when we talk about just workforce dynamics. And so the benefits of really communicating effectively with 5 generations in the workforce is, of course, paramount, both on a bottom line perspective and a social perspective as well.
Absolutely, completely agree. Does anybody want to add to that?
I mean, one thing I would say is sort of Accenture, we help companies who are transforming and dealing with really technology and the disruption. And what we see is that in some ways the technology is the easy part. You can figure out what the right business model is, but the really hard part is how do you get all of the people in the workplace to embrace the change and drive the new business models? And that's where you can see the benefit of having different generations, because the millennials, most but not all, are digitally savvy, right? But they don't have the same kinds of experience that you have for their older workers who are really necessary to understand what's happening. So one of my favorite examples is when Volvo announces that they're going to take all of the liability for their autonomous car. Well, it's not just about cars, it's about insurance. Right? And what is that? And you have to have the experienced people who understand the implications. And so you need to bring those together, because at the same time that digital's changing these businesses, you do have your older workers, many of whom the research we've done are not comfortable, right, with the digital changes in that. And so the benefit of bringing it together is you can really get the millennials to help on the digital side, and the older workers, sometimes called wisdom workers, who can really bring the business experience that's needed.
I like the wisdom workers. Okay,
Wisdom workers is good. That is good.
It's rapidly headed towards that category. I like it better. That's awesome. I think you're saying some important things there, because I think one of the things that has been popularized is that there's a lot of things going on with millennials that we need to start creating cultural support for millennials. We need to start making sure our infrastructure, our technology is aimed towards millennials. And when I talk about generational differences in the workplace, one of the common themes I hear most from many workers, even millennials, is stop focusing on me. So please change the conversation to how do we work together? How do we manage conflict when we come across it? How do we find together the wisdom of people maybe who have a bigger, broader map than maybe millennials have yet to experience. So I hear that conversation more as sort of a growing bit of a backlash and disengagement from older or wisdom workers who are saying we have a lot of knowledge to bring to the table, and we have a lot of things yet to contribute and engage in, and we want to make sure we're part of that conversation.
Now that's really, really well said, because I think we're talking so much about the millennials, right? And they're taking over the world per se, and so how do we actually factor in what they want to do? But at the end of the day, that also changes, and we've talked about this, Aniela. This changes kind of the whole model around what does career development mean, right? Can you say more about the work you're doing in that space?
That's right, and capitalizing on what Amy said about this need of creating a broader picture. I think that traditionally we used to think of a life cycle as being primarily focused in the young years on education, then consuming our middle part of our existence into work, and then retiring in one discrete event that leaves place for leisure in life. That kind of model actually, it's no longer in tune with the lifestyles and the lifespans that we have nowadays. So investing in continuing to train the older wisdom workers so that they are reskilled throughout their professional lives, that they have a chance actually to keep up with the technological advances, it's becoming so very important. On the other hand, starting to develop the young workers to become leaders when they are in their 30s, it's probably already too late, because by that time they have already changed the organization that they work with 2 or 3 times. So starting to also develop leaders in the organization much earlier on in their career, and also thinking of the fact that as the wisdom workers stay longer in the workforce, the entire speed in terms of promotions in one talent pipeline might diminish. So therefore, how important it's becoming to think about lateral career moves that will allow people to feel that they are developed when the promotion opportunities are more scarce. And I would say that last but not least, can we rethink the ideal worker profile? So we are not only thinking about what we used traditionally to think. An ideal worker is somebody who works fast, 24/7, head down, full-time, full force for their entire life. Is there maybe a place to include in this ideal worker profile characteristics of the wisdom workers, such as being a great mentor and being extremely experienced in one particular topic?
Right. Well, first of all, I love the fact that we've coined the word wisdom workers today. So there you go. Credit goes to you. But it's really interesting, right? Because if you look at leadership development theory, there's 2 things that strike me, and I'll be curious to gather your views, particularly yours, who based on some of the work you're doing now. This whole concept of that there's no longer the career trajectory, the sort of traditional career trajectory. You move up the ladder, from position to position, but it's more about being part of the career lattice, where you're actually engaging in different experiences to learn more, right? And we all know, and leadership theory tells us this as well, that the best leaders are those who experience or develop the most learning agility. So they actually learn from these experiences, take the feedback, and act on it. And so it's interesting to see, what do we do as organizations to really address that issue? What practical things can we do?
Well, on that note, too, I think it's really important to note how we're educating the next generation of the workplace as well. We're not so much educating the specialist as we are educating the generalist. And I think when we talk about that horizontal shift within the workplace as well, that we're seeing to get that position, and you might be able to attest to this at Accenture, is that it's not so much about the student who's got the 4.0 or even the 3.8, but who's got that breadth of experience, who's volunteering in the clubs, who's part of the societies, part of the sports and the extracurriculars. How can we have a diverse resume with a lot of experience in many different fields and the ability to network and communicate and actually interact with people in order to fill these positions. And then once in these positions, to see that learning curve remains steep or as steep as possible. Again, sometimes a horizontal move is just as good as a vertical one when we're continuing to learn new things. I mean, one of the best quotes that I heard is that a change is as good as a break. And so to see new surroundings, new environments, new leadership, and new communication styles will keep that engagement higher from what I've seen.
And Eric, you touched upon a very important factor for the economy. I mean, when we look at from the labor market's perspective, multi-generational workforce is a must, not is a choice. Today we do have, and we from the institute we have a lot of data on employment, and we are seeing that there's a talent gap, right? The openings right now in the U.S. in the labor market is growing much faster than the filling rates, right? Based on the latest Department of Labor data. One of the things that's happening, and this is where I think Generation Xers play a very important role. The baby boomers still staying in the workforce, they are not delaying the retirement. The new generation coming in, the Gen Xers will build the bridge, the talent bridge, and the transition of that talent, that knowledge, not only the institutional knowledge, but the skilled knowledge to the new generations. Because what we see today in the economy, not only for this high-tech IT jobs, but also sectors like manufacturing, construction, there are a huge number of skilled worker gap, the lack of skilled workers. The firms are ready to hire, the constructor firms or manufacturing firms, but there are not enough skilled workers. So it's not only about the white collar skilled workers, but also blue collar skilled workers. Therefore, that knowledge transition can only be happen by building multi-generational workforce in the labor market so that we can build a healthy labor markets for the economy.
Right. No, it's very, very well said. I think it raises another point that we talked about on our call too, which is how are roles changing, right? So let's look at the facts for a second. If we look at millennials and women, by 2025, 70% of financial decisions will be made by women and millennials. So what does that mean in terms of how do we market to these individuals? How do we engage these people on a regular basis? And that means that roles are changing, right?
Yep.
So how do we address that?
Well, I brought some empirical data from our employment database. So it's the slide one that you see. So from a gender perspective, I have some good news and bad news. What you see in the slide is the labor participation for each income group, female versus male, right? So you have to look at, when you compare genders, we have to look at specific income groups, because if you look at the average, it's really very misleading, okay? So, and then what we were able to do to track the millennials over 8 years, to track the Generation X and baby boomers. So this is not by age, by birthday. So we follow the same cohort of workers from 2008 and 2000 until 2005. So the good news is, my friends, ladies, in terms of the participation to the workforce, women have similar share. I mean, you see by all generations, boomers at the top, Generation X being green, and millennials. But there's really a break point there, which is around 140,000, right, income level. So for higher income groups, so for more managerial jobs, right? This is a proxy for the supervisor managerial jobs. Regardless of the generation, women are not participating as much as men. So the number from 60s to 50s falls to 30s, 20s, and even lower. But the good news that for the millennial women, their participation to the management has grown up over 8 years. So that's really, I mean, they are doing much better than my generation and the older generation. So that's really a hopeful data in terms of how millennials coming into the workforce from a gender difference perspectives.
For sure. Oh, absolutely. So we're going to see a faster transition trajectory, if you will, that we've
Yep.
seen in the past.
So I
Ariella?
can add a little negative information, however. So we just did some research around the impact of digital fluency, really meaning basic digital skills on women and men, and their career development. And so the good news was that when women have digital fluency the same as men, they actually do accelerate in their career and can help close the gap. What was disturbing, however, is when we looked at millennial women against millennial men in terms of aspirations of leadership. So millennial women in this study were at 56% aspired for leadership as compared to the entire group, which was 49%. So that seemed like really good news. However, when you looked at men, so all men, the average was 56% compared to 49%. But when you went to millennial men, it went up to 67%. So the gap actually widens. Now, again, this is just one study. We looked at 5,000 people, different generations across 31 countries. But so while we saw, like, I'm not surprised to see more, right, because it jumped from 49 to 56, but the gender gap widened in terms of aspirations to leadership.
And in fact, unfortunately, when you look at from a wage differences, if you can pull the second slide, you're going to see more. Again, this is hardcore data from 2008 to 2015, based on 24 million employees in the United States, actual data. The wage, let's take a look at the 2008, both men and women. Yes, women are always making less on average, But look at from 8 to 15, how much male income increased versus women, and look at the gender difference, the generation differences. In fact, millennials, and these are again high income level, 140 plus, more supervisory managerial jobs. In fact, their wages stay stagnant. Whereas we still see some growth rate for Generation X and baby boomers females, not as much as male. But it's interesting. I was really fascinated and surprised actually. The millennials female from 8 to 2015 wages actually for this cohort stay the same.
Yeah, that's very well. There's an intersectionality, right, between the aspirations, as you just said, gender parity and pay parity. All of these issues are coming together. So I think it's important to really kind of get down to brass tacks and understand what can we actually do about this.
You know, when I talk to women and ask them about what they want to do with their career, because often in the position to provide some sort of mentoring relationships, and the conversations I have with millennial men and women do tend to be a little bit different. I think it would be the same in some other generations, but I tend to be mentoring more the millennial generation. And what they end up saying are things like, I want to make a contribution, and they start describing that contribution. Women do in non-economic terms frequently. The things that they want to do with their coworkers, the things that they want to do with making a difference for our customers. Those are hands down important things to talk about. The men tend to bring up promotions and salary as correlated directly to their contribution. So I don't want to make a sweeping generalization because I'm moving from data to anecdote, but anecdotally, I think you have to ask yourselves to some extent, we're really struggling as sort of a policy, a regulation question about gender and pay. And I think there's some fundamental questions you have to ask about gender and the nature of the assumption of contributions to the workforce. And I'm not arguing there's a clear answer there, but I do think there are gender differences in how they talk about them.
And is it more about the generations or the age group? So this always, I always think about this. So we talk about the generations and generations, but I wonder, a 30-year-old millennium comes to my age,
Right.
and whether they're going to act like me or like 30-year-old millennial continues. So is it about the age group or is it about the generation, the birth date?
Well, I'll throw out my views, and I want to throw this out, and I know Eric has a view on this as well. I mean, this gets back to the whole concept of intersectionality again, right? Because you've got a person of a certain age who may be a man or a woman, who may be black or white, who may be part of the LGBT community. You're not any one thing. So I think there's definitely some theories out there, and more than anecdotes, to give you some more credit, about decision-making processes and how women have discussions, right? And how they actually approach promotions and our lack of orientation in general towards risk, right? We know, for example, I'm going to divert for a second and get back to you here, but we know, for example, and I'll see if people in the room are aware of this fact, that when women look at a job description, they will only go for it if they fit, right, 90% of the criteria. Right. When a man looks at the same job description, if he fits 50%, he goes for the job. So there's a basic orientation towards risk that we have to also sort of underscore as we think about this intersectionality as well. But Aniela has a point. So please go for it.
In what you just mentioned, Patsy, I think that there are some patterns that are so well known and so well documented in how men and women relate to money, to positions of power, how they negotiate their pay. What stops us from changing the processes, the policies, the practices that organizations have in place so that they act as interrupters for those kind of behaviors? So creating a setting where there is actually a level playing field. And I will give you an example. For a very long time, hotels were trying to persuade us to switch off the light when we were leaving our rooms. And we all care about the environment, and we had the best intention to do so. But our mind, our human mind, is prone to error. So every now and then, the light was still on. And then they invented the central switch. So now they no longer rely on my individual behavior, but they created a setting in which my behavior does not influence to the same extent the outcome. When I leave the room, the switch will do its job. And to give you so can we create corporate environments that create those processes and environments that will not leave space for these individual behaviors to introduce biases? So to give you an example, an experiment was conducted in the US last year for a certain number of companies that were coming from the male-dominated environments to understand that there was specifically focus on is there a negotiation skill gap between men and women in the way they negotiate their salaries. And the experiment consisted of one very simple intervention. In the job advertisements, there was one line at the end saying salary is negotiable. And just putting that out there, so making the rules of the game very clear for everybody, just that closed instantly what was thought to be a gap in the negotiation skills. That created that switch.
Right. Well, a lot of it, I think, and I would imagine people in the audience would agree, and when we get to questions, we hope you have some on this topic, but we talked a lot about this as well, which is transparency, right? So it's basically making this information available for people to do what they will with it, whether it's around pay, communication style, gender dynamics, all of these things combined. But once you start opening up the dialogue and creating that transparency, you then can change the culture, I think. Did you all want to add to that? Because I know we talked a little bit about that in our conversation on the phone. What does that look like in your organization, for example?
So when we think we've recently changed our entire approach to talent. And so we have 370,000 people worldwide and 50,000 in North America. And we have three pillars. The first is around transparency, because we believe transparency creates trust. And that shows up in two ways. So with respect to multi-generations, we have now a performance management, we call it performance achievement, where leaders' priorities are public. People look at their strengths. Everyone gets to see the strengths on the team. And the idea, and this goes to how you actually manage different generations, is they come together as a team, knowing each other's strengths, knowing each other's priorities, and being able to set norms as a team. On the other side, we also take that step forward in terms of things like we release publicly our demographics around gender and ethnic diversity, because we're trying to make change there. And by being transparent, you can have a completely different discussion. And so transparency is definitely a critical part of how we're managing talent. But then we go to what we call hyper-personalization. And that is having individual conversations and individual feedback that's forward-looking. So we got rid of ratings. And by the way, when we announced this, since we announced this about a year ago now, over 200 sort of G2000, Fortune 100 companies have come to talk to us about this, because it's so central to how do you move organizations, how do you deal with the different generations, and how do you create a culture of continuous learning and feedback. And you have to start with how you're managing your talent. And then finally, the idea of listening and input. Right, so all of this in terms of including understanding how women are experiencing the workplace, and that comes from where you establish we're going to listen and then act, right? And so we've done things like crowdsourcing around the employee experience. We changed our policies around having, when women come back from maternity leave, to actually being able to work locally, because we listened to what the women were saying as to why they were leaving. Right? And so those three pillars address a lot of the issues that we have both with multi-generations in gender and ethnic minorities, as well as veterans and persons with disabilities, because they share a lot of the same common challenges in the workplace.
Right. I think that's well said. I think the whole concept of, and how we try to boil it down, and I think we've all talked about this at various stages as well, is the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? So you can bring in a whole bunch of diverse people, but if the culture doesn't support it, it's not going to work anyway. So you've got to kind of have a multifaceted strategy, to your point. You get the information out there, you make the dialogue possible, but then you also have to create that culture that holds people accountable to allow for diversity to be effective. So it really ends up being part of the dialogue, I think, in many ways.
I think one of the things we underplay, though, in the practical infrastructure on this is diversity is going to yield different ideas. Now, that seems completely obvious. Different ideas yield conflict. So you have to actually be able to handle conflict productively.
Yes.
We talk an excellent game about understanding that diverse people, diverse skills, diverse backgrounds bring diverse ideas. Our on-the-ground ability to manage through conflict, though, I think remains undertrained, misunderstood, and under-rewarded for the people who do it well.
Right.
And so I think practically on the ground, managing conflict is one of the things that we have underplayed curriculum development for, and rewards and incentives and consequences as well.
It's an excellent point, and it's a great debate point that comes up a lot in these types of discussions, because you're spot on. The science tells us that more diverse teams leads to more conflict. So I personally couldn't agree with you more in terms of education, but accountability as well. Conscious Eric, we haven't had you speak for a few moments here, and I know you have views on two things. I'm going to call them out here, on many things, but the two we'll call out now.
Sure.
One is this piece, just around, how do we actually manage the conflict piece? And the second is, which is switching gears almost entirely. I know you have a view based on your work that it's important to really take into account the individual versus the stereotyping.
Yep.
So can you comment on both of those?
Yeah, I think I'll comment on the individual versus the stereotyping first, and I think the perfect case in point is exactly what Julie said. When she talked about Accenture and she talked about the 3 pillars, when she talked about transparency and when she talked about collaboration and when she talked about hyper-individualization, she never talked about generations once. I think that's a really important point to make. When we talk about generations, I want to throw out the idea and perhaps throw this whole conversation on its head that generations are a bit of a false construct. And let me work into this a little bit. We're all familiar with Moore's law, but there's also another theory called the knowledge doubling curve. And that was highlighted today at the IBM presentation at lunch. But basically the knowledge doubling curve says the amount of information that we have access to doubles now at a near exponential rate. Now this isn't hard data or hard science, but it just gets the point across that we're dealing with the integration of technology to being at this very steep curve. Now the theory that I'm working on is, with respect to this integration of technology, is that the time span a generation occupies with respect to it would have to shrink at the same rate, but inverse to the integration of technology into the places that we work. So to suggest that we're being fixed with these 15-year cohorts that are generations is a bit of a gross misunderstanding of people. Because in the United States alone, we could be looking at 80 million millennials. In Canada, I came down from Vancouver this morning, we're dealing with 7.5 million millennials. Now, when we're trying to generalize people and we're trying to attract and retain people, to generalize people to this degree and say that a millennial is a narcissistic job hopper that lives in their parents' basement and watches Netflix all day might be a little bit dangerous, right? Now, there are those people, certainly, but there are also the opposite of that as well. And so when we talk about conflict management, which was the second part, I don't think we're really talking about millennials at all. We're talking about people. And I think when we're talking about attracting and retaining these people, that we're not at all talking about attracting and retaining millennials. We're talking about attracting and retaining people. And when we talk about the job description must evolve from a skills and requirements checklist to an actual fit document that talks about the culture, the lifestyle, the ecosystem, the environment of the organization to identify if that fit's really there. Because if we can attract talent based on the fit, based on the true culture, one that's not aspiring necessarily to be Google's, but to be the best of our own, based on the environments that's established and the people that are thriving from this environment, that ultimately we're not going to create the best workplace culture will create an optimized workplace culture for the people that work in that organization and for the people who want that experience when we look to attract people to it. So I think that as we shift this idea from generalizing and stereotyping generations to focusing on the individual and the culture of the organization, optimizing that culture and the person that fits within it, that when we build that trust, when we have that transparency, much like Julie was talking about, that it's not about bringing generations together, it's about closing a talent, an age, and a communications gap based on being radically transparent and bringing people together for the right reasons.
Okay, Eric, you had me until
This is good.
Okay, here we go.
you
Let me
had
just-
me until you got to kind of the fit. And
Okay.
so here, what you're saying not only sounds good, it is good. So I understand what you're saying. Take it to a manufacturing floor. Take it to people who do
Sure.
literally jobs that are redundant skill kind of jobs, repetitive skill jobs. So move it away from jobs that are a bit more kind of rely on sort of intellect and team, and take it towards something that is a bit more repetitive. Does it still work that way?
I
Do you
think so.
still look for that fit and that culture and
Yeah,
so play that
I
through
think so.
for me a little bit.
There's a lot of talk about tribes and belonging. And in one of my recent presentations, I talk about the rise of CrossFit and yoga and spin classes and Zumba, not because of the physical benefit that it gives and does to our body, but because we're able to relate and communicate and interact and actually experience things with people that share the same values. Now, in the work that I'm trying to do is really looking to articulate the values and experiences of the people within these positions, regardless of sector or industry, to understand tribe, belonging, and ultimately redefining success. Because traditionally what we've seen as success is the person with the best financial standing, the most education, the sexiest job title, or the most accumulated material. Now, success, much like a snowflake or a fingerprint, is going to be different to every person that views it.
We do have tribes and snowflakes now in this discussion, so I like it.
Okay,
I like
hey.
There you go.
I like
More
it.
words being coined.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that it comes down to not necessarily just articulating the values and experiences, but or the skills and requirements, but the values and experiences of the people to attract people to positions, regardless of sector or industry, based on what that real experience is going to be.
Do you think there's something to be said, just thinking out loud based on what you both are throwing out there? I mean, I think we're seeing two things, and happy to be debated here, also with the audience. Number one, a lot more people, regardless of age, gender, or otherwise, are working towards more purpose-driven organizations, hence the rise of corporate social responsibility, sustainability, topics of that nature, now being at the forefront of business as opposed to a separate entity. I think we're also seeing another trend, and that's more about organizations actually, similar to what you were saying, Eric, focusing on less on domain expertise and more about relational skills and leadership skills and things of that nature, where we move away from the kind of basic job description more to we need someone who can engage 5,000 people on this topic. Those are two trends we're seeing. What reactions, thoughts?
Yes, but we have to be careful about the sectoral differences here.
Yeah.
Again, we have to differentiate the labor markets, the organizations, whether you're running a software company in Chelsea, in New York, or you're in a manufacturing plant in Ohio. There are many differences how you manage the generations when it comes to that. So, and I think, again, to that point, it all depends on the sector you're in, the business you're in, and the job titles you are in. So I agree with Eric in a way that we are, I think, stereotyping these generations. One of the things that we have done actually, we just released the evolution of work study, right? Everybody talks about future of work, so we had to do something about that too. But we did not look at it from an economic impact or technology impact angle. We looked at it from a human-centric needs perspective, HR perspective. And we uncovered 5 human-centric needs, and this was a study among all generations. One was the freedom, the need for freedom, flexibility, the need for knowledge access, information access, the need for self-management, because technology now, if you have the freedom and the information, then you are autonomous, the third one. But the fourth was stability, the fifth was meaning. Now, when it comes to freedom, it's a must, right? Everybody wants freedom. I'm at Gen X. I love to work from anywhere, anytime, and I'm sure Eric does too. But there's a little bit nuance there. The way I look at it, if my company gives that to me, it's kind of a perk. I'm grateful. Well, my generation, my millennials in my team, they demand for it. They feel they have the right for it. So there are there are differences in the behaviors, the way we look at these human-centric needs. And then there was another one which was interesting, came very different in the results, that was more around the stability. The other ones are cliche, right? The technology, everybody wants to have an access to the information, social collaboration, so I'll pass them. But the stability, the definition of stability was different among millennials versus older age generation X and baby boomers. So I'm going to say that older age versus younger age. Let's not use those generational terms. And the way the stability of for the older workers were more around like loyalty. I want to have a job. I need my paycheck to feed my family. That's how I feel. I have 2 children. I got to bring food home, right? So that is my stability about the work environment. But the millennials, the respondents in the survey, and this was a global survey, more than 2,000 employees, millennials see the definition of stability different. They see it is my brand. It is not the company. It's still, I want the stability in my job, but it's all about my brand, my skill set. It's not about what the company gives me. It's about what I give to the firms. And that's actually we are seeing with the increase in the contract workers and 99s, the gig economy, all those fancy trends that we are seeing. So there are really distinct differences that we are seeing in the labor market among the generations, but not all. So there are many commonalities as well. I think for the businesses, it's very important to embrace these differences, to understand these differences, and quite honestly, we all know one doesn't fit all. It all depends on the business you are in and the composition of your demographics in your labor force.
Right. But just to also add to the debate here and make it a little bit more, we're going to have a little more debate here, or arguing, or however we call it. But I find it fascinating, and I want to hear what you all think, that I feel that we have discussions on a regular basis. When I say we, I mean the collective we in various locations around the globe. How do you deal with diversity and inclusion? Whether it's gender, whether it's multi-generational, or whatever the topic may be. I feel like we know what to do. We talk about education, we talk about holding people accountable, we talk about programming, we talk about building the right culture. Why are we not doing it? Why is it not happening? So I'm going to bring in the different angle and get the perspective of all of you on this topic. What is holding us back? And when I say us, I mean the collective us across corporations, governments, all across the board.
Patsy, maybe I can jump in with an idea. I think that one of the things that holds us back is that we expect these changes to happen naturally. We kind of see that there have been some positive evolvements towards a goal, so we kind of feel that if we just sit back and leave the things unfold, it will happen naturally. There is nothing natural about it. I mean, it does require that evidence-based approach in understanding what is the nature of your own workforce. Whom are you recruiting? Whom are you promoting? What are the behaviors and skills that you reward? And who are the people who are let go? Because at the end of the day, these are the elements that will be the unwritten, very powerful rules in the organization that will point towards what are the values that organizations truly value. So I think that this expectation that things will evolve naturally, combined with maybe this lack of, or the necessity of having an evidence-based approach to this, and formulate diversity strategies based on solid workforce analytics. Probably these are the 2 aspects that hold us back and also can become the catalyst for change.
Right. That's great. Well said. Great points. What do you all think?
I think it starts with 100 interactions every day. So I think
Absolutely.
it's expecting our leaders to be able to help translate better than they do today. So if a younger generation worker says, you know, how can I make, you know, what's next for me?
Right.
Because honestly, they ask that a lot. Older generation workers are hearing, when's my next promotion? When I ask what they mean behind what's next for me, they mean, how do I make a contribution? How can I continue to contribute? How can I continue to create great meaning for the company that I'm part of and that I believe in? That's completely different though, but giving both the younger generation worker the language to say it slightly differently and helping other generations understand it a bit differently happens 100 times a day in the workplace. So we make it seem like it's a program. We make it seem like it's, you know, sort of going to be this big episode, or we even put like governance structures, you know, diversity councils and things like that. When in fact what it is every, you know, 1 time an hour, 2 times an hour, trying to go back to conversations that people are having and giving them different ways to say and do things.
Yeah. Well said. What do you think?
I'm sure at the end of the day, it's probably an and and an and and an and. But fundamentally, we are asking people to be disrupting themselves, right? Because in inclusion and diversity, we're asking leaders who are still today the majority white men, right? And it's difficult to disrupt yourself. You see that when we talk about business and we say, you know, we are going to introduce automation, right, which is going to cut jobs and cannibalize our own business, right? So when we ask people to be disruptive of themselves, it is really hard. And that's why I think it's an and and an and. I completely believe that inclusion and diversity is something day in and day out, but I think it also requires real courage, whether it's disclosing statistics that aren't great, whether it's saying we're not going to let the same people choose their leaders. When we do that reorg, we're going to have someone separate say, no, you don't get to pick your friends and family. We're going to set a goal. We're going to have someone else independent do it. Because, and again, it's unconscious bias and it's human nature, right? And for a long time, we've accepted incrementalism, right? Set the tone at the top. Every year you get a %. That's great, right? I think not even just because it's the right thing to do, but from a business perspective, to be innovative enough, we need to get more aggressive. And that requires different tactics.
Yeah, no, that's also very well said. And I'm conscious of time because I just got the card up there a minute ago. So I'm going to ask one more question to the panel and then open it up to the audience, if that works for everybody. So on that note, building off that, one of the things that I personally, but our firm feels very strongly about as well, is how do you integrate diversity and inclusion into the business? Exactly that. So for many, well, that's great when the moderator's phone goes off during the presentation. Excuse me for a second, I'm just kidding. But to really kind of integrate it into the daily business of how you operate, right? For so many years, diversity and inclusion functions per se might sit separately kind of in this corner office or this back office more frequently and not necessarily play an active role with the business. So well, all right, we're going to turn this off entirely. I apologize. So I'm curious. So one of the things that we've done actually is to engage with our salespeople and our business development people on what diversity and inclusion, corporate responsibility, all these topics actually mean and how they can bring value to the business in that capacity, right? And so we're spending a lot of time doing that, as well as developing products based on what we do as an organization that support diversity and inclusion. So question for all of you, and I'll start with this side for the moment, Ahu. What do you think is the best way, or how have you seen efforts around diversity and inclusion really integrate well into the business?
So if it's all about not a stat, then it does. but if it is just a statistical data point, then unfortunately there's no way to integrate that. So I'm a diverse, I'm probably one of those diverse workers in my company. I'm a female, I have an accent. So, and I'm hoping that I am the head of the research institute, and I'm hoping that not because I am diverse, that's why I got this. So we have to be careful because because of the political correctness, sometimes we make wrong decisions just to make the numbers. And I have seen this in my career. And it bothers me as a female also. So I want this to happen naturally, but it will take a lot of time. So I think it will integrate to the business in a productive way when the need is being understood by everybody very naturally. So this shouldn't be a push from top down.
Right.
So
becomes part of how you operate. And people
this
think
should be
that
very
way.
natural, yeah. But we are not there. We are not
Right.
there.
Right. Fair enough. Ariella?
Yeah, obviously, I do have a very different opinion on that, because one of the things that we have observed is that if we want diversity and inclusion to be perceived as a business critical goal, then we need to see organizations displaying the same type of behavior in pursuing the goal of diversity and inclusion as they do when they pursue business critical goals. So if I were to ask you as decision makers in your organization, what keeps you awake at night and how you react when something keeps you awake at night, probably you will tell me, well, we measure where we stand, we track progress,
Right.
there is accountability for results, and there is full support of the top leadership team, which comes with resources to reach that target. So I think that these are the 4 points around which we saw the most successful articulation, because then diversity and inclusion is not perceived as a layer on top of the organizational core purpose, but it's central to it, and it's central to the human capital strategies, and it's central to ensuring the sustainability of the human capital of an organization.
Absolutely. Very well said, Eric.
I'll keep my answer fairly brief because I think the other panelists will have more to say on this topic. But I think that, like has been said before, it does have to become second nature. And I think that, again, when we're able to articulate the differences within our organization and really bring people together based on who they are and what they value, that diversity and inclusion will just be part of the game. And when we talked about change before, it's no secret that people like the idea of change, but people don't like to change.
Right.
And so if we can create this, I don't want to use more buzzwords, but organically and actually promote that collaborative workplace, that diversity and inclusion will be less of an afterthought and more ingrained in the organization from the ground up.
Yep. Very well said. Other thoughts?
If we're not willing to give people a curriculum on how you handle conflict, this will not get done the way we want it to get done.
Great point.
We call that meaningful conversation training.
Yes.
I like that.
And it's
Another
real.
word.
Yes.
And I actually spent my first 6 years of my career as a change management consultant at Accenture, so I do know that. It's not perfect, though. Nice try.
This
though.
is since
Yeah.
you've been there.
Oh,
so
fine.
we rolled out performance achievement.
Wait, you guys kept moving after I left? I don't understand. Yeah.
But when we rolled it
Doubt
out,
it.
that's what we had to train people. How do you have meaningful conversations that allow people to get to know each other, understand differences, and be able to talk issues through?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Well said. We call it courageous conversations. So there's a whole bunch of buzzwords, but it's
Exactly.
important. I'm just going to add one thing to that. I think another very important point, and I know we've talked about this before as a group on our call, and this does sound like a buzzword, but I have to say it because I think the whole point of unconscious bias is something that we just can't ignore. Because when people go through unconscious bias training, or whether it doesn't have to be formal training, it can be an informal dialogue, but when people actually awaken to the biases that they have, they don't realize they have, it is a very, very powerful experience. So I would just add that to the list as well. We are running out of time, but we do want to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have a question for the group?
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Scott Heathman. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And I really love the discourse between Eric and Amy, because that gets at the heart of what I hear every day. I hear from a lot of senior leaders about those damn millennials. And it really kind of ticks me off, because in one sense, it's a complete misunderstanding, and I think it's a leadership problem, not necessarily a millennial problem. But Amy, you brought up a good point. I have a lot of airmen that are very tactical, have very hard skills, not the soft skills. So how much of that, and that will contribute to maybe a followership curriculum to help them develop, whether it's millennial, Gen Y, Gen X, just some self-awareness of how you interact within an organization, how do you contribute to your leader's goals and intent. Are we missing, though, I think a critical piece, and this might be different for your opinions, but are we missing a critical environmental aspect to how much this actually dictates the typecasting of the various generations?
I can take a first stab at that. I'll be the first one to say that this isn't strictly a leadership problem. I'm not removing the responsibility from millennials in the slightest. I do think in some cases it certainly is a leadership problem, and in some cases it certainly is a millennial problem, much like we can't generalize who's at fault or who's to blame, where the problems are lying. I think that when we talk about these different generations, though, and we talk about the environments that they're working in, I think if we're able to build trust and manage expectations earlier, that if we are radically transparent, that was mentioned before, and we're able to build up a little bit of an idea, a little bit of a profile as to what that experience will be, that will be proactive to culture as opposed to reactive to it. And again, if we can prevent the wrong people from coming into our organization right off the bat, then I think we can mitigate some of the problems, some of the conflicts that we'd be having within these organizations as a result of bringing the wrong millennials or people onto the organizations. Feel free to hear what Amy has to say.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, because when I talk about tasks that are, I have a lot of workers that would really respond well if I would use more, I'd call it command and control with them. But what I know is that I make leadership choices every day, and that I run the risk of disengaging very heavily a bunch of my population and background if I use command and control all the time. So when I lean on things like authentic leadership, storytelling, that tends to have an appeal for even the group that responds to command and control, but also the groups that don't respond to that as well. So I think making more intentional decisions about how you lead and not relying on history in terms of the types of leadership you bring to the table can be motivating, and you can find styles that cross a bunch of diverse audiences.
I think I'll add one last thing, just to emphasize Amy's point around storytelling is so important, because there's a relatability component there as well. And if we can see how that job enables a lifestyle outside of the 9 to 5, or perhaps it's longer or shorter, whatever that might be, understanding how that work will enable a life that I want to live, then I think that that's really important as well. But again, that storytelling I think is essential regardless of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Hi, thanks everyone for your time. My name is Angela Shi. I am currently a PhD candidate in chemical biology at Harvard. And so as a part of the millennial generation, I guess reluctant millennial, I don't know. I was wondering, when we start to have this dialogue between millennials or anybody and leadership, and there is the stereotype that millennials are entitled, that we're whiny because we feel entitled to want things. How does that conversation fit into kind of evolving the culture, as opposed to immediately saying, no, this is not the type of millennial or the type of person that we want in our corporation or on our team, as opposed to like kind of taking these criticisms and moving the culture forward, as opposed to being stagnant and being like, oh, this is a box that we want to stay in.
Great. You want to start?
I mean, I would say again that we try to avoid saying we have these sweeping generalizations of what you just described, and that is, and many companies are going to this much more, seeking to listen and understand people, right, and their employees, as opposed to having this be around. I mean, I rarely have a conversation with a client that says, help me understand the millennials. They help me understand the people. And so we do a lot of work, for example, around moments that matter, right? It's part of bringing the consumer experience to employees. And those moments that matter, we don't look at it about generations. We look at it about the employees, the different segments. It might be segmented by creative versus those who are more command and control. And so I don't think there's actually, at least what we see in clients, this movement towards sort of this confrontation and we don't want them, as more of there's a war for talent. It's true in every single industry, right? And each company is really focusing on the type of worker they need, the type of employee, and what matters to them, with probably the one trend across being every industry, really every company feels this need to be more consumer-like, meaning really delighting the employee they need. And that's what we see.
Yeah. I think we can take one more question.
Hi, thank you all again for your time and your comments. My name is Jasmine. I'm corporate counsel at 24 Hour Fitness. I have a lot of experience doing diversity and inclusion work at law firms in the Bay Area. And an interesting thing, a phenomenon in law firms is we don't talk about doing diversity work because it's the right thing to do. We talk about it from the bottom line perspective because everybody already knows it's the right thing to do. We sort of cast that aside.
Right.
And I wonder if doing that casting aside actually perpetuates the rift between diversity and inclusion, which we've talked about being two totally different concepts. And supporting that sort of thought from the law firm perspective anyway is we continue to push unconscious bias and implicit bias trainings, which actually have had the net effect of absolving people from guilt or responsibility in saying this isn't my fault. This isn't actually something that I can control. It's something that everybody has. So I don't actually feel responsibility to do anything about this. So I'm wondering if there are conversations at your organizations happening to sort of reunify diversity and inclusion from these perspectives.
I'd like to see someone
Yeah.
in my organization say that to me. Just try that.
The-
I'm absolved, Julie.
Exactly.
I'd like to
Well,
maybe
Go ahead.
reflect on what you said. I think that, yes, we do have that assumption that it is known in the organization. It's always very good to check the assumptions and to make sure that there is a sense of shared benefits for everybody in the organization, because I think that in all organizations we do have a historically underrepresented group and a historically overrepresented group, that whenever these talks around diversity and inclusion appear, the historically overrepresented group will have a reaction to that unless there is this sense of very clear shared benefit for them. So it's always good to check the assumptions and to be as clear as possible on what these shared benefits are. And I think to your point, there's actually a very interesting book that was just published by Iris Bonet. She's a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And she talks about how these unconscious bias trainings are giving moral license to people. It's like when we do fitness, then we feel entitled to eat a bigger bar of chocolate after we worked out because we deserved it. It's a little bit the same mechanism, right? So one of the things that we have seen working very well is creating different role models and leaders in the organization that react very clearly to those behaviors that are not in line with the values of diversity and inclusion, however unpopular those reactions would be.
Right. So we're going to have to bring this session to a close here in a second. I'm going to add one comment to that, I think, and it's going to sound a little bit trite, and I really don't mean it to be, but I think at the end of the day, in order to have a successful, there you are, diversity and inclusion effort, you can't lose sight of having a multifaceted strategy that's sustainable. So corporate words, a bunch of, sound a little corny, but at the end of the day, you've got to keep hammering away at it, right? It's the individual conversations, it's the storytelling, it's the role modeling, it's the accountability, it's the education. But you've got to keep putting those pieces together and keep hammering it away at it, because it's very easy to lose sight of the diversity versus the inclusion and the business case versus the behavior. So I would just add that piece as well. With that, I'm sorry that we have to close. There is a red sign that was held up. We don't want to fall through a hole in the ground here, but thank you to all of our panelists today for all of your input. It's been great. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. We really enjoyed the time. Appreciate it.